Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you're able to see me and hear me and all of those things. I'm looking at my colleague on the other side of the room. I've got a thumbs up, so we're good to go. So let's get a few things straight about what this session is all about. This session is about you asking questions, and I'm glad to see we've got a question already. So do keep the questions coming, and I have the FX6 here. We can see a close-up of the FX6, and we can see the FX6's output. So ask those questions. I'll try and answer them as best I can. I'll press the buttons on the camera, and I will do the things that you ask. No tricks, no smoke, no mirrors. So it's your chance to try and play with the camera remotely, as it were. So first question that I've actually got, so a couple of things actually. Housekeeping, yes, this is being recorded. Obviously it will be on YouTube anyway as a video that people can play back and watch later, but we're also recording it locally at higher quality, just in case we lose our internet connection or anything like that goes wrong. Hopefully it won't, but yes, it's being recorded and will be available later. So some questions that have come in. So best profile to match the FX6 to an FS5 in S-Log2 or 3? Well, frankly, you would just set the FS5 to S-Log3 because the FX6 doesn't have S-Log3, and then you would set the S-Log3 into its Cine EI mode and shoot S-Log3. And my recommendation there for both the FS5 and the FX6 is going to be S-Log3 with S-Gamut3.Cine. Now, what I will say straight away is they're not going to be a perfect match. These are two different cameras with two different sensors of very different vintages, and they will look different. Those differences won't be enormous because, both cameras are S-Log3 and S-Gamut3.Cine, but you will need to do some tweaking and adjustment, and there won't be a magic LUT that will always work to make it look right because the camera's sensors have different responses to light. So under different lighting conditions, the differences between the cameras will be very slightly different. But it shouldn't be a major drama in post-production to just tweak those differences out between the two cameras. And let's also just be realistic about this. If the FS5 looked as good as the FX6 and looked the same as the FX6, there would be absolutely no reason for buying an FX6. You'd just continue shooting with your FS5. So the reality is this is a newer camera, it's a better camera, has more dynamic range and better color science, and unfortunately that does mean it looks a little bit different. But with some tweaking and grading, you should be able to get them reasonably close. So questions are flowing in. Yes, this is a Flowtech. I think this is a Flowtech 75, perhaps this one, but it is a Flowtech tripod. They are great little tripods, really easy to set up. Okay, so can I explain S-Cinetone? Right, that's a really good question. So right now, the FX6 here is set to S-Cinetone, and this is what it's outputting. So S-Cinetone is the FX6's default look. So when your FX6 comes from the factory and you turn it on, that's what it will be set to. And S-Cinetone and S709, so you might have heard those two things. So they're two different things, and they are actually quite different. I thought they were the same initially when I first came across them, but they're not. So S-Cinetone is loosely based on the Venice camera, the Venice Cinema camera's color science. But, and this is the big thing, this is aimed for broadcast and what you would call direct-to-air applications. So this is, this is as we have it set now. The camera is just switched on, turned on, and that's what it looks like straight out of the box. And it's different to Rec 709. So let's dive into the menu for a minute. So a long press of the menu button takes you into the main menu. And if I go down to my paint settings here, and I go into scene files, we have several different scene files in the camera. And in fact, I've got quite a few in here. If I go to standard, this is pretty similar to the FS5. And I select that. So this is what an FS5 will typically look like out of the box. And it might be a little bit hard to tell in the stream, but it to my eyes at least, 12 dB again, don't need that, let's get rid of that. To my eyes at least, it has a very sort of video-like look. If we zoom in on the highlights on the vase in the background, it kind of goes from being not overexposed to being overexposed very quickly, very rapidly. And this is what gives it that sort of very much normal video camera type look. Now, if we go back to the S-Cinetone, and one nice thing is the camera does remember where you were last in the menus, and recall that. If you look at the highlight, the difference isn't actually that. I was hoping the difference might be a little bit bigger than that. But you do get a much more gentle roll off into the highlights with the S-Cinetone curve, and it does tend to give you a much more pleasing image. Now, the nice thing about S-Cinetone is that S-Cinetone is designed so you can get a slightly more contrasty look or a slightly flatter look without having to do any grading. And the way that works is simply down to exposure. So let's see if we can do this, because we don't have a huge dynamic range in this shot. If I bring my exposure up, the image definitely gets brighter. But if you look at the blonde girl in particular on the chart, she's quite flat looking. The girls look a little perhaps washed out. If I come down in exposure a little bit, not only do they become darker, but they become more contrasty. So that gives you the choice. It means that if you want to have a more sort of TV look, daytime soap opera, you might expose it about there. And my skin tones at the moment are around about 65 to 70%. If you want more of a film-like look, you just bring that exposure down just a little bit. It's about half, 3/4 of a stop. My skin tones are now around about 60%. And suddenly it's a lot more contrasty, perhaps a little bit more moody. And that gives you this very different look. And that's really what S-Cinetone is all about. It's not really designed to be graded. It very much is what you see is what you get straight out of the camera. And that's different to when you shoot with log and then you grade it in post-production. And if you're shooting with log, and I'm sure we'll get back to log at some point today, you'll use the S709 LUT, which is similar but different. So S709 is designed for a grading film-like look. It's quite flat, it's quite washed out. You have to expose it fairly dark. In fact, white, when you're exposing S709, is 77%. It's way, way down. It's a very much lower level. So there are differences between them. So let's have a look at these questions. Loads of questions coming in. Wow. Where should we go to next? So somebody Andrew wants to use an A7S as a B camera to the FX9. I'll be perfectly honest here, I've only played with the A7S a little bit, but it does look a little bit different. It's obviously the same image processing, same electronics, but some of the goals are slightly different. So the A7S is very much a photography camera, and I don't think Sony wanted to stray too far from the look of other alpha cameras in the way it looks out of the box. So it doesn't have S-Cinetone. If you go to standard, on the A7S and on this, they're pretty close. The S-Cinetone and the standard look are not a million miles apart, and a little bit of tweaking in post-production, you will get them quite close. If you're shooting log with S-Log3, then they're going to be really, really close. I haven't tested this, but I suspect because it's the same sensor, it's the same log and everything else, they will be very, very, very close. So I don't have access to an A7S III right now. Sony, let me have an A7S III and I'll do that test. Okay, what are the implications switching from an FS7 II to the FX6 concerning lenses, center scan use, audio options, timecode, etc.? Lots. This is a very different camera to the FS7. The FX9 is much closer to the FS7. So the FX6 really is a 4K full frame camera. So it's a 4K sensor at full frame. And what that means is that if you want to shoot Super 35, then it's HD only. So that if you only shoot HD, then you're fine, just shoot in HD. Other things to remember, there's no interlaced recording in here. So if you're doing stuff for a broadcaster that requires interlaced, that's going to be a challenge for you. You can shoot at 50p or 60p and get an interlaced output, but it doesn't record interlaced. There is no center scan mode like the FS7 has, because there aren't enough pixels. To go from full frame to a center scan mode, the resolution would actually be around about 1.4K or something like that, well below HD, so it really isn't something that you want. So they are very different cameras. So if you do need center scan, if you need a Super 35 mode, really you should be looking at the FX9, because that's what that camera can do, because it has a 6K sensor. So I'm going to move on fairly quickly. Excuse me. Will the 25 FPS interlace feed, will it cut with the output from a PMW 500 and a Vision Mixer? Yes, it will. So if I go into the menus, let's bring up the quick menu, just a quick press of the button. And if I go now to my output options, trying to think which page they're on, they're here. So for the streaming reasons, I've got the wrong output up, sorry. For the streaming reasons, we're having to output HD into the switcher over the HDMI at the moment, but it's progressive. But let's see what happens here. I'm going to take a bit of a risk here, because I'm going to change the frame rate of the camera. Now, I wouldn't normally do this during a presentation. This may all go horribly wrong. So let's go to 50p, set. And what's going to happen to my stream? Ta-da, there we go. We're now at 50p. Now if I go to the output format, and we go to here, and I touch on there, you will see that down here, we have good old 1080i on both HDMI and SDI. We also have the different levels that you sometimes see for different applications. You can have progressive on the SDI and interlaced on the HDMI. So you do actually have quite a good range of options in the output. So that's really not something that you need to be too worried about. You definitely can get a proper interlaced output out of the camera, provided the camera is set to 50p or 60p. It doesn't give you interlaced if the camera is set to 25p. Okay, so lots of people asking about matching between the A7S and the FX6 again, and they are different cameras. So they have different priorities. In custom mode, in that sort of not log mode, they're close, but they're not identical. If your shots are quite different, if the two cameras are at two different camera angles, you probably wouldn't really notice that they're different. But if you have two very similar shots, then that difference will become apparent. But when you're shooting log, no problem. Most of that goes away, because in both cases, it's S-Log3 and S-Gamut3.cine in both cameras. So other than not having 8K, what are you losing out compared to the FX9? Well, the FX9, as I said, has interlaced. So if you're doing stuff for a broadcaster, that's a big deal. You have Super 35 scan mode in the FX9 in UHD or 4K. You don't have that in this. In the next firmware release of the FX9, you'll have center scan, and you'll be able to use 2/3 inch B4 ENG lenses with an adapter on the FX9. You could do that with an adapter that goes from B4 to, in fact, actually, no, you can't, because I haven't seen one. I was going to say full frame, but I haven't actually seen that. So really, if you want to use those B4 ENG lenses, if you want to have a center scan mode for Super 16, if you want to have Super 35 to use all your nice cinema lenses, your PL mount cine lenses, things like that, if you need interlaced, if you need to stream, if you need proxies, all of those things. There's actually a lot of things that the FX9 does that this camera doesn't. There are also things that this camera does particularly well that the FX9 may be not so good at. 120 frames per second in UHD. The FX9 can't do that internally. LUTs are always available no matter what frame, what resolution or what your output is. The FX9 is a bit more limited in that regard. So there are differences between these two cameras. One does not really replace the other. Personally, I think the FX9 is a camera more aimed at people that want a jack-of-all-trades camera that might one day be shooting a corporate video, maybe doing a live feed for a broadcast shoot the next day, and then perhaps making a short film or movie a day after that, because the FX9 can do all of those, and takes all of those things in its stride. The FX6 I see more as the owner-operator that wants to make short films, maybe even there's no reason why you couldn't shoot a big, long, full-length feature film with this camera, that wants to do a lot of their own projects, corporate video where you don't need interlace, you don't need Super 35, and all of those things. So the width of things that this camera can do is a little bit less than the FX9, but the things that it does do, it does very well. So I think all those things need to be considered. Let's see what else. Could I demonstrate the autofocus operation for you? Absolutely, why not? So right now autofocus is on. Now I will say that one of the things with the FX9, when that came along, I was very skeptical about autofocus. I was one of those guys that used to stand in the front of a workshop and go, hey guys, autofocus is for amateurs. I am obviously now an amateur because I'm using autofocus all the time. When you've got autofocus that works really well, and once you've learned how to use it, and this is an important thing, guys, autofocus, it's a skill to learn. And I can see some of you going, what the hell is he on about? There are various things in this camera that we can set and change to alter the way the autofocus works. So bringing up the camera, just by pressing this button here, number 2, button number 2, on the side of the camera, I can change various parameters. So I can change the transition speed. That's how quickly the autofocus changes. I'll show you that in a moment. I can change the subject shift sensitivity. That's how responsive the autofocus is to changing. And then also I have various zones within the camera. If I go into the main menus for a minute, you could assign this to an assignable button, but I haven't actually done that at this stage. In my shooting menu, autofocus or focus, we also have different focus areas, and they are wide, zone, and flexible spot. So starting with wide. Wide covers pretty much the entire sensor area. It really does cover 98% of the frame. So pretty much anywhere you are within the frame, the autofocus will work. And actually that's what I use most of the time. Then the other setting we have is zone. So this is a smaller zone. You can just about see the little orange corners from it. And now I can actually use this with the touch screen. So if I touch the other side of the screen, I can just pop it over there. I can drag it up and down and around the screen. I'm just using the touch screen here to move that around. So that's really quick if you want to sort of isolate one part of the image from another. So let's just do a little experiment here. So we've got various people in my image. We've got the girls in the picture at the bottom, and we've got Paul Hollywood in the background at the top. I've moved my zone up to the top now. So what that should mean is that my autofocus, it doesn't recognize him as a face. There we go. Let me just use the AF assist here for a second. So I've just used the AF assist. So AF assist is a function that works very well with the Sony lenses. So what the AF assist allows me to do is to just turn the focus ring to change where the camera is focusing. So if I use it again, so we're actually in autofocus right now, and you can see that the autofocus has actually identified the faces of the girls at the bottom. But because they're not in the focus zone, they're outside of that focus zone I set, the camera isn't going to respond to them. So let's just bring up the zone again so you can see it. See, it's up there. So it's ignoring the girls at the bottom of the frame. Now, if I move that zone back down to the bottom and I use the AF assist, it's now going to track and focus on them. So AF assist and the zones can be used together. See, if I now try and use the AF assist to move the focus to the background, it doesn't really like that. It's going to want to come back to the foreground all the time because of where my zone is. So you can use the zone in combination with the AF assist to really sort of help isolate your shots. If we go back into the menu, we also have flexible spot. So if I want to be very specific where I focus, I can drag this around within my scene. Let's just pan up a little. And that's where the camera will focus. So if I want to now focus on the girls, I just move it down there, focus back up there, and I can just move this around the frame. Now it doesn't track. So if I move the camera, it stays where it is. It doesn't move I know the A7S3 has a lovely feature where it sort of locks onto the subject and moves around. This doesn't have that. But the focus is really very responsive, and I can use the zone to move my focus very easily. So I just want to do pull focus from the flowers to the background and so on. It's really easy to do. And it's a lovely feature. Now I'm just going to go back to wide area. And we'll look at the responsiveness. So actually let's, we'll start with responsiveness. So if I now go to locked on, and now once the camera has focused on something, it's going to stay focused on there pretty much no matter what happens. So at the moment we can see the camera's focused on the girls, even if I put my hand in the shot and do things like that, and so the camera can't see them, the focus isn't going to change. It's not going to focus on my hand because I've set the camera to locked on. So if somebody walks through your shot, it's not a problem. If I now go to, from locked on, I'm going to go to responsive, we'll have a very different response. So now when I introduce my hand into the shot, come on camera, the camera decides not to play ball today and refuses to focus. There we go. And yeah. So now it's being responsive. So as soon as I take my hand in and out of the shot, the camera will focus and change. Now the other adjustment we have is the transition speed. So if I turn it up to 7 really fast, now what's going to happen is that focus change will happen very, very quickly. But maybe that looks a bit too much like autofocus. So maybe we want a slower transition speed, and now the focus will happen much more slowly. So a big difference there. And the skill with autofocus now is actually understanding how all these different controls interact depending on what it is that you want from the camera. So typically for me, I tend to have the shift sensitivity around about 4 and the transition speed probably around about 3. So now when my hand comes in, it's not going to instantly refocus. There is a delay. I remove it, there's a little bit of a delay before the camera refocuses. And that, I think, tends to give me a very sort of natural, human-looking autofocus. Okay, talking about the lowest temperature for operation would be around 0, someone has commented. I haven't yet had a chance to test this in extreme conditions. So Sony's the Sony specification is 0 to, I can't remember, it's plus 40 or something like that, I'm not sure. They always give a 0 figure because they are guaranteeing that no matter what, that's what it will work at. Now, from experience, I took my FX9 this year up to Norway, and it got down to minus 43C, and it worked fine. And I've taken various Sony cameras over the years up to Norway in the winter, and anywhere from minus 20 to minus, I think the coldest we've had is about minus 46, and it's always worked. And I have no doubt that this will be the same, that it will work down to probably minus 40 degrees. The only issue you get when it gets that cold is with the LCD screen. And if you ever see your LCD screen starting to go dark or black around the edges, that's a sign it's about to freeze. And if it freezes, it will crack. So you need to avoid that. And that happens at about minus 39, minus 40 degrees once the screen reaches that temperature. When the camera is on, there's enough warmth in the electronics that even if it's about minus 45, minus 46, this will stay above that critical point. But you need to watch that. Below about minus 10, 15, the LCD becomes sluggish and smeary. All LCDs do that and become tricky to use. But that's normal. That's just standard with any camera. So I'm not going to recommend you or sell you this camera will work at minus 30 degrees. I haven't tried it. I haven't tested it. But I have every confidence that it should. It's not something I'd be concerned about. Obviously, you get the usual limitations with batteries not lasting as long. So keep your battery in an inside pocket and things like that. So talking about the LCD screen, somebody's asked about the quality of the LCD screen. I tell you what, let's see if we can get a bit of a shot of this. If I just slip it off the camera for a second. it is much better than the one on the FS5. This is actually the same, I believe it's the same LCD panel as the FX9. It has much more contrast. It's brighter. It has better color response. It is quite a shiny screen. You can see it catching the light, but that shininess does two things. One is because it's a touch screen, so you want a nice smooth surface. And the other thing is that that gives you better contrast. So yeah, it's a big improvement over the screen that's on the FS5, FS7. It's higher resolution. This is a 720p HD screen now. The FS7 screen is something like 540p or something like that. So it's much, much better. And that also means that things like the focus magnification and all of those things work much more nicely. Okay, so what else? Does the AF work with adapters like the Metabones and EF lenses and things like that? The answer is maybe. And it's a big maybe because it depends on the adapter, the lens, and a lot of different things. I know, the more recent Sigma lenses, they're pretty good lenses and they have pretty good autofocus now. And optically, we know that the Sigmas are very good. And with an MC11 on the older lenses, generally the autofocus works, but it might be a bit more laggy than a Sony lens. It won't be quite as responsive. And one of the things actually about autofocus that I think a lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to, let's bring the camera up again, is all the time when you're using autofocus, the camera is making tiny, tiny adjustments to make sure the autofocus is working. Now, if I bring my hand in here, so we block the girls out, so the camera does refocus. An important thing with autofocus is the way the background changes. If you've got a lens that breathes a lot, or a lens where the bokeh changes in an unpleasant way when the camera refocuses, you can get some, so as I do this with my hand, now obviously the focus is, just move around a bit closer to the front of the camera. So as I do this, the camera is refocusing. Look at the distance measurement at the top of the screen. So 0.7, 0.6, 5. And do you see anything? Well, you can see the background changing. Obviously, the background is changing a bit. But if you've got a lens that breathes a lot, or where the bokeh changes significantly and things like that, and you're doing an interview and the person you're interviewing is moving a little bit, that background change becomes quite distracting. And it's one of the nice things about the Sony lenses is that the E-mount was originally designed for the NEX cameras, and they did video. So Sony's E-mount lenses have always been tailored around working with video. So they tend to use the rear elements to do their autofocus. Not all of them do, the vast majority. And that minimizes shifts in the background when the lens is refocusing. And that's something to watch out for. I've noticed that with some of the, especially with the older Sigma Art series lenses, that you get some really weird things that go on with the bokeh and background during a shot. The subject appears to stay the same, but you see some changes. So to be able to say or recommend a third-party lens and say, yes, it's going to be fine, is really hard, because you need to understand what it is that you need from that lens. And frankly, I think you need to test it for yourself and see whether you feel it's suitable. Generally, and this is a very broad brush generally, an older, and I say older more than 3 or 4 years ago, E-mount lens with an adapter will not perform like a Sony lens will. The AF will be less responsive. It may hunt a bit more. It may be a bit more laggy and things like that. Some of the newer lenses that are coming out very recently are much better. Now, the one and only lens that I can recommend as actually as an alternative to the Sony is the Tamron 28 to 75mm 2.8 E-mount lens. And that performs really well with autofocus, and I'm very pleased with the way that lens works. I haven't tried the 17 to 28 that goes with it. There's a nice 17 to 28, and I suspect that will be similar, because these are very recent lenses that were developed really directly for E-mount. So, and then again with the EF mount lenses and things like that. It depends on the adapter that you use. Some lenses work best with the MC11, some lenses work best with a Metabone, some work best with a Comlight. I've got a Sigma lens that doesn't really like working with the MC11 but works fine on a Comlight, and I've got another Sigma lens that doesn't work with the Comlight but works well with the MC11. So there's lots and lots of variables there. So it's really difficult to give a definitive answer to that question. Moving on. Okay, wow, so many questions. Not sure we're going to get a chance to answer all of them. Okay, so will I be creating a series of instructional videos for this camera? If enough of you talk to your people at Sony and say, please, could you help Alister to make a series of instructional videos for us? I will. I want to do them. There's some really cool features in this camera that perhaps people haven't come across before, and I would love to do a series of videos, and I'm getting a big thumbs up actually from Visual Impact, so maybe watch this space. Perhaps they'll sponsor that, and we can do something. Maybe we could do them as lives instead of doing it as a pre-recorded video, and then people can ask questions in more depth and have some longer videos. So one of the limitations with when I do these videos for Sony is they want to keep them condensed. They want to keep them under 15 minutes ideally. We're trying to cover an awful lot in 15 minutes. So, you know, if you want this style where we can pick a subject, go into it in great depth, then maybe that's the way we'll do it. Maybe we can do it a slightly different way around this year and do something like that. That's something we'll definitely have to think about. But I would like to do it. Okay. Could I do a video session on matching the A7S III and the FX6? Well, again, we'll think about it. Your comments are all here and noted, so these are all things that we can discuss. Right. I got various people offering me to lend me their A7Ss. Thank you very much for the offers. I'm sure we can work around that. Raw output, quality difference between the F5R5 and the FX6 Atomos, color dynamic range and resolution. So I do actually have a Shogun 7 on the camera right now, so I can output raw to that if I want to. Quality difference. It's a really difficult one to quantify. Now, F5, F55, that sensor is now somewhat dated. And you know, it's 8 years old, I think, that the F5 sensor. And this is a much more modern sensor. It definitely has more dynamic range, at least a stop more dynamic range. You can put it up on any test chart, and you can see the difference. Let me just bring up a PowerPoint slide here. So you can see here, I've raised the brightness level in this slide so you can see the levels a bit better. But I can definitely count 15 bars. Now, is that usable? I'm not going to say they're all usable. I don't believe they are. But if I do exactly the same tests with an F5, I can count 14 bars, whereas I can count at least 15. And you can see a hint of a 16th one with the FX6. So it has more dynamic range. Now, in terms of what's usable, this has more than an F5. Maybe not a huge amount. But what's really nice is the way it overloads. So when it clips, this clips in a really nice way. The FX9 does too. So there are definitely differences between these cameras. We have now a much nicer color response in my view. It really is. One of the things with a CMOS sensor, with video sensors, is they rely on color filters above the pixels, and CMOS can be sensitive to infrared. So there's a very careful balancing act that has to be played between how far the camera can see into the deep, dark, deep saturated reds, and when you get a problem with infrared light. And I think Sony, since the F5, F55, those cameras came out, have actually been able to do a much better job of getting that balance right. So they're able to see further into the reds without having infrared pollution. And what that means is you get better skin tones, because a lot of a face skin tones are at the red end of the spectrum. So if you're having to add more amplification to the red to make up for lower quality optical filtering, the skin tones never look as nice as when you have a natural sensor response where the red response is already very good and you don't have to boost it or amplify it. And that's where FX9, FX6, and of course Venice as well do much better than those cameras. And it's incredibly difficult to see sometimes and to quantify, but you just look at a face when you shoot it with this camera compared to an F5, FS7 and those cameras, and it just looks nicer. It's one of those little subtle differences that it's so hard to do. And it's just the subtlety, and especially with a warm face or skin tones, they just look more real. And obviously then that transfers into the RAW recording. So the F5 with the R5 on the back records 16-bit linear RAW. This is outputting 16-bit linear RAW to the Shogun 7, but the Shogun 7 can't record 16-bit linear. So the Shogun 7 takes that 16-bit linear and converts it, and Atomos, the term Atomos uses visually losslessly, to 12-bit log RAW. And 12-bit log RAW is a great format, it really is. And frankly, in terms of gradability, how much you can push it and pull it, I can't really see much difference between the footage that I used to shoot with my F5 and R5, or an F55 and R5, and what comes out of this when you record it ProRes RAW. But there are differences in the workflow. With this, it's ProRes RAW. If you are already using FCPX and a Mac user, fantastic, go straight in. You can also edit it in Scratch, in Assimilate Scratch, and you can also edit it and grade it in Premiere. But Premiere, it's not really a grading tool. And I've never been happy with the image quality that I get out of Premiere recently. You can't take ProRes RAW into DaVinci Resolve, which is what I use to do my grading, whereas the XOCN or the Sony RAW from the R5, you can. So it gives you greater possibilities that way. But the flip side of that is you can't take the footage from a F5 and R5 into FCP because it won't read it. I don't quite know what's going on between Sony and Apple, but there is clearly something that's not quite happening there. So it depends on what you want with your workflow. Now, what I have been doing, and it's a bit of a workaround and it's not ideal, is I've got FCPX. I can use it, but it's not my favorite tool. So I bring my ProRes RAW into FCPX, turn off all the LUTs and everything else, and output a basic S-Log3, S-Gamut3 to 12-bit uncompressed. And then I take the 12-bit uncompressed file into DaVinci Resolve and grade that. And I've been getting fantastic results doing that. I really have. It's really nice. But I'm not quite getting every last little ounce that I want, but I'm getting more than enough to get what I want. So I'm happy with the workflow. So I used to own an F5 and an R5. I wouldn't go back, to be honest. This or my FX9, either of them, outputting RAW, are at least a match, an equal to, but I prefer the colors from these cameras, and I prefer, and having autofocus and all those other things that we have in these cameras really do mean that I don't want to go back to my F5 and R5. If you've got an F5 and an R5, it's a brilliant camera, it really is, and it makes beautiful, beautiful pictures. You know, this camera hasn't made it obsolete, but things are moving on, image quality is getting better. Right, okay. Who should we get in touch with Sony? Just tell your Sony rep or whoever that you would like me to make some videos, and we'll see if it happens. Can I demonstrate controlling the camera with the app on a phone? Oh my goodness, now you're really putting me on the spot because I haven't tried that yet with this camera and my phone is on the other side of the room. If we get time, we'll come back to that one. Right, so could I demonstrate IAF following an eye? Right, let me see if the chart is big enough. Okay, it's not quite big enough in the frame, and the camera doesn't really like pictures, it likes people better. But you can see now, if I bring up the camera, that what happens with the autofocus is the white box is the girl that the camera is focusing on. Let me pick the blonde girl here. Right, so I've now registered her face, which is why you get the double box, and that says that she is the preferred face. If I go to this girl here, click, she is now the preferred face. And now the camera's identified her eyes, we get this double box, and that's now telling us that that is the preferred face, and that's the eye that the camera is focused on. And if I pan and move the camera around, which kind of simulates how somebody might move around in the shot, you can see that the camera does a pretty good job of following that. Let's unselect her. So if I select again to go to a single box, so we're now just back to face priority, and well, you're going to have to put up with me wandering around the front of the camera here. Hopefully this will work. And there you go, straight away it's picked up my face and an eye. And now glasses, they can be a problem. It depends on obviously sunglasses where it can't see the eyes, that's going to be a major problem. But generally glasses, if the frame isn't too thick or too obstructing of the eye, that will work. And it really is the autofocus on this camera. The same with the FX9, it's really one of the best things about it. Obviously, if I do that, it goes for the other eye. Look at that. It's actually amazing sometimes what it recognizes as a face. I don't have a face mask, but if I had a mask on, even then, once it's kind of got the face, it will still very often track it without an issue. So it's really, every time I do these demos and I play with the autofocus, it never ceases to amaze me. It's very, very effective, and it really does work very, very well. Okay. The quality in crop mode the same as normal mode in the FS7? Well, this doesn't really have a crop mode unless you want to shoot in HD. So if I want to shoot Super 35, which is the only crop, well, let's rephrase that a bit. So the camera has various crops, and let's actually have a look at that. So let's bring the camera back up. Okay, so at the moment, we're shooting full frame, and we're shooting in, I'm just framing this up so that, let's see, if we use so you've got the yellow of the visual impact sign at the back, just touching the edge of the frame, and the edge of the white and grey card on the left. And this is UHD full frame. Now, if I want to shoot, and this is quite strange actually, if I want to shoot in 17:9 UHD, so let me just switch the camera to UHD set. We've actually cropped in to the image. Normally, when you go to UHD, you actually expect the frame to become, to DCI 4K, sorry. When we go to DCI 4K from UHD, you actually expect the field of view to get wider. With this camera, it doesn't. It gets narrower. If I go back to UHD, the image becomes wider again. So when we're in UHD, the camera is actually using, I believe, 4.2K of pixels. When we go to 4K DCI, we go down to using 4096 of pixels, 4K DCI. So actually the image becomes slightly narrower. Now, if we want to output RAW, let's have a look at that. So let's just for a minute go back to UHD. And now let's change the codec. Actually, I can't do this because I need, just trying to think, there's a limitation here. Oh yes, if I want RAW out, I have to be in Cine EI mode. So let me go to, change my shooting mode to Cine EI. Okay, so we're now in Cine EI mode. We still have that same frame size. You can just about see the edge of the white and grey card on the left side of the frame, and the yellow edge of the visual impact thing in the background is on the right-hand side. If you want to output RAW, so change my codec to any of the RAW options, we crop in even more, because now we're doing UHD, and we're now only reading 3840 of pixels instead of the 4.2K that can be read. So the camera crops in up to 10% depending on the recording mode. So that's something to be aware of. If I go back now to just the ordinary XAVC-I and UHD, the image becomes wider again. So we've got various crop modes that you need to be aware of. Now, if you want to shoot Super 35, then that's only possible in HD. So if I go to HD, we're now in HD, and now I can change my scan to Super 35, and we have Super 35 scan in HD. So it's compared to the FX9 and those cameras, it's a lot more limited with scan modes. There's no center scan mode that this camera has. It's either Super 35 or full frame. And when you're in full frame, there are various crops depending on the record format and the frame size that you're using. And this is something you do need to be aware of. So actually the UHD is very slightly wider than the UHD that you have from the FX9, but the 4K DCI is the same as the FX9's 4K DCI. So it's all a little bit different, and it's all a little bit confusing. It took me a while to figure it all out. Okay, so memory cards. How many do you need for a day's shooting? Well, it depends on the codec that you are using. So at the moment in the camera, I have a pro-grade 64GB card. There you go, you can see that little pro-grade card. These I find, they work, they're good value for money, and they seem to be reliable. It's a V90 card, so it works at all formats and resolutions. So if I put the card in the camera, you will see that currently 50p HD, that card is going to give me, why don't I have my record time being displayed? Okay, yes, 35 minutes. There it is on the left-hand side in the bottom. So I get 35 minutes from that card. Now, if I go to a different recording format, so let's come back to full frame, and let's go to UHD, and let's go to 25p. Hopefully that's not going to, here we go, the stream is still alive. So XAVC-I 25p, now what we're going to get is, again, around 31 minutes, because we've lowered the frame rate now, so we're not shooting at 50p anymore, so it's not a big change in record time. So we'll get 31 minutes. Now, if I obviously go to 50p, that will halve. That will go down to about 15 minutes. There you go, 16 minutes. So it depends on the frame rates that you want to shoot at, and a lot of things. I mean, my suggestion would be, and what I've sort of budgeted for myself is I've got 4 128GB V90 cards. The V90 cards will record any of the frame rates that the camera can do in any of the codecs up to 60 frames per second. But if you do want to shoot the high-speed UHD 120 frames per second, then you do need to have a CF Express Type A card. You really can't get away with trying to use these. So if I now press the S and Q button and the camera goes into its S and Q mode, and I press and hold the button, I can change the frame rate, and I can go up to 120 frames per second. Now, something that comes up quite often is autofocus. So my base rate is currently, let me just remind myself, is 50p. So if I go to 100 frames per second, we select that, you'll see that that says there 100 frames per second AF and MF. So the autofocus is going to work. He says it's favoring the girls, of course. Come on, camera, wake up. I've got so shallow depth of field now, but the autofocus is working. Now, and that's because, and the autofocus will work in S and Q provided the frame rate is a multiple of the base frame rate. So 50 frames per second base rate or 25 frames per second base rate, then the AF will work at 100 frames per second. If, however, I want to go all the way to 120 frames per second, you'll see now it says 120 FPS MF only, manual focus only. The autofocus won't work. Now, if I was shooting 24p, if I was shooting 24, 30, or 60p, then the autofocus would work at 120 frames per second, but not 100. So that's one of those things to be aware of. Now, coming back to the camera, if let's just brighten things up a little bit here, try and record that now on this card. In fact, if I just take the card out, put the card in, you'll see I get a not guaranteed media warning. That's telling me that the camera doesn't think it can do it with this card. I'm going to press record. We're shooting at 120 frames per second, and on the surface of things, it all looks fine. We seem to be recording okay. Doesn't seem to be any drama. Now, if I stop recording, let's start recording again. Another clip. We're okay. Stop recording, start recording again. Let's try it again. We're still okay. But my experience is that these cards will fail. And when they fail, it tends to be quite catastrophic. You will get a complete failure, and it gets worse and worse as the card fills up. So when the card is empty, the card tends to be pretty quick and will perhaps cope with that 120 frames per second. But once the card starts filling up, it gets a lot slower. And also the cards get really hot. So the SD cards, if you try and shoot 100 and 120 frames per second on them, they get really, really hot. And I've had a couple where the labels have started peeling off. They've become that hot. So this is still all good. This card today is going to behave. Look at that. It's really not something, though, I can recommend. I'll leave the camera running at 120 for a minute, and we'll see what happens. See whether it manages to keep going. Okay, so yeah, 428 gig cards, and then maybe a couple of CF Express Types if you want to do any slow motion and things like that. Can I talk about changing the FX6's look in custom mode using different LUTs? Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good one. Actual dynamic range is about 15 stops. Usable dynamic range out of that, what you can actually use, well, it depends on how much noise you're prepared to do, how much noise reduction in post you're prepared to use, and all sorts of things. It's not a simple black and white answer. Oh, there we go. Look, camera's crashed. So the camera has crashed. It says, oh no, it hasn't. It's just media near full. It hasn't crashed. My mistake. It's just, it's still going. Look at that. Okay, so changing the base look in custom mode. So let me just come out of this. Now, one thing I will do actually before, if I go to thumbnail now, let's see if the camera's going to work. It is. These pro grade cards are pretty good. Okay, right. Let's come out of S&Q. We are changing the base look. So at the moment we're in the Cine EI mode. So let me come out of Cine EI and just short press of the menu button. Let's go back to custom mode. So I've already done it on this particular camera because I've been fiddling around with it. But the camera has this really great ability to allow you to use a LUT in custom mode. So I'm not in S-Cinetone or anything else. Come out of S&Q. So again, there's another crop there when we go into S&Q. You can use a LUT to modify the way the camera looks. So let's go into the main menu, press and hold the menu button to go into the main menu button, and go to my paint settings here. And we saw this earlier, we have these scene files that we can go through to change different things. And if I go to the recall, you'll see that they're actually built into the camera, S-Cinetone standard still, ITU 709. I don't have anything in here. That's a bummer, because I don't think I've got any LUTs on my card. I'll have to talk you through it, but basically what you can do is you can go to this base look function here, and oh no, I do have them in. I do have some base looks in here. Okay, so right, start again. So we have scene files built into the camera, and we can recall these, and you'll see that we have, there's 4 here, S-Cinetone, standard, still, and 709. They're built into the camera. If you put the camera into the HDR mode, you'll also find that there is another couple of HDR ones. So you have 6 built into the camera. But as well as the base looks, if we go to, as well as the scene files, if we go to base look, we can actually go to import, and these are LUTs that are on my SD card. Now, to load the LUTs into the camera, you have to put the LUTs onto SD card in slot B. Now, the easiest way to do it is to get an SD card, put it into slot B, format the SD card in the camera. So you format it in the camera. That creates a load of folders on the card. And if you look through those folders, you'll go to Sony, Pro, and then there's one called LUT. And that's where you put your LUTs. So you put your LUTs into that folder, ordinary 33 times cube LUTs, and then you put that into slot B in the camera, and you can then go to this page here in the menu, and you can load that LUT in as a base look. So if I go, so these are hypergammas that I've got in here. I'm going to go to this one here, broadcast 1, and, oh, hang on, I've got to remember where I am. Right, so in the import process, you go to import, and then the first thing you have is these are actually slots in the camera. So I'm going to put a LUT into slot number 6 in the camera's memory. These are the LUTs that are on the card, and I'm going to put this LUT here into that slot. So it's going to copy that LUT, which is, this is a LUT that I created. It's on my website, XDCam User. It's a broadcast safe LUT, because one of the things about this camera is none of the built-in gamma curves are broadcast safe. So click OK. So that's been loaded into memory number 6 in the camera. Now I can select, if I go down to number 6 here, that LUT in custom mode. And you probably saw the image change. And now if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, just below where it says XABCI, it says AC BCS, that's the broadcast LUT. So that the look that we've got right now is the LUT. So we're actually using that LUT to create the whole quality of the image. And this LUT, as I say, it's broadcast safe. So you can see that even if I overexpose it, it doesn't go above 100%. So that, one of the nice things, I'll show you something else while I'm here. The orange lines on the waveform are the zebra levels. So if I go down to monitoring and I go down to zebra, and if we put zebra 2 at 100%, you'll see that's the 100% line. And this LUT, even if I pointed at the light here, won't go above 100%. This is a broadcast safe LUT. Now, that means the beauty of this, it means you can load any LUT that you want into the camera. At the moment, I've only got hypergammas in here, so I created a whole set of LUTs that are the hypergammas. So if we go back to the paint menu, and I go to the base look, and I select, we could have one of these hypergammas as a LUT. So I could have hypergamma 3. So this is hypergamma 3. So if you wanted to match another Sony camera with hypergammas, you could do it with the LUT. Again, these LUTs are on my website. Now, hypergamma 3, though, is not broadcast safe. You can see we're now going above 100%. So the ability to bring in these LUTs is brilliant. And then what we can do beyond that is we can adjust the look. So we've got a LUT, in this case it's hypergamma LUT, but we could go into, let's say, the multi-matrix here, turn this on, and I've got the blue axis selected. Let's go to yellow, because we've got lots of yellow here. Let's go to the yellow axis, and let's change the hue of that. And okay, so I'm not quite sure which axis the yellow, the visual impact yellow is in. It's obviously not quite that one. I think it might be in the minus. You can see it's going green. We're making the yellow in the sign green by changing the hue of it. So we can actually modify the LUT through the matrix and the multi-matrix. And that gives us a tremendous amount of flexibility. Let's just turn that back off. So You can also change the black level. So if you wanted to make this a bit washed out, I'm just raising the blacks here, so it's not necessarily something you would do, but if you did want to raise the blacks, you can. And if you wanted to crush the blacks, you can. So this does give you the ability to take a LUT that you like, modify it a little bit if you need to, and you can have quite a few of these stored in the camera. I think it's 16. Yeah, 16 of them. So you can have all these different looks ready to go in the camera. So I'm just going to go back to scene files. I could store this now, and I could save it as a scene file, so I can use it again in the future. I'm not going to do that right now. But I'm just going to go back to S-Cinetone now. S-Cinetone, and we're back to S-Cinetone. And something I was mentioned before about being broadcast safe. S-Cinetone goes well above 100%. Look at that, goes 109%. All the gamma curves in this camera go above 100%. So if you are doing broadcast work, be wary of that. Even if we go to just sort of, let's go vanilla 709. Nothing special about this at all. This is just your bog standard 709. It goes above 100%. So you need to think about perhaps modifying the knee. Let's do that really quick. So what we can do with the knee, so at the moment it's on auto. We go to a manual, turn the auto knee off, so a manual knee. If you lower the knee slope, the knee point, I'm going to bring it down to about 83, and then the slope you raise. And now if I come out of the menu, no, not enough. Did it raise or lower the slope? I'm trying to remember which way this goes on this. No, I'm sure it's raise. But you, by adjusting the knee, you can, and the slope, you can make the camera broadcast safe. In fact, yeah, there you go. You can see it's brought the white down now. You'd need to really have an external waveform connected to do this nicely. But I think it's something like 83 and 60. Yeah, not quite, a bit more. Just increase the slope. There we go. Knee of 83 and 71 with the 709 curve can make you broadcast safe. But that knee and slope is going to be different for each curve. So it's something you have to figure out for each curve, depending on what you want and where you want your knee to happen and all those sorts of things. I'm just going to turn that off because that will probably mess me up in a later workshop or when I'm out shooting. Let's go back to auto knee. Okay, so what else do we have? We are running out of time a little bit. So how good is the dynamic range in the second extended ISO compared to its low base ISO? There is very, very little difference. 12,800 ISO, I've actually got a slide for that. Might be easier to see here. 12,800 ISO compared to 800 ISO. There is some more noise at 12,800 ISO. And that's going to reduce your dynamic range, or what you can use out of your dynamic range, a tiny bit, but it is only a tiny bit. I kind of wish that, I'm dying. I kind of wish that the low bass, that's not a funny joke actually at the moment, is it really? Low bass and high bass, I wish they weren't so far apart. 12,800 is just a ridiculous ISO. And here was something that somebody raised on another YouTube video, actually somewhere else, as a comment. And it was something I'd forgotten all about, is that light is noisy. So the light that comes off all these lights in the rooms isn't perfectly smooth. It actually has noise. It's something called photon shot noise. Now, when you have a lot of light and a really good exposure, it swamps that photon shot noise. So you never see it. So when we're shooting at 800 ISO, perhaps even 4000 ISO, you won't ever see the noise that's in light, assuming you're exposed well. But when you start using these really sensitive, really high ISOs, 12,800, or if you start going above that, you actually start seeing the noise in the light. So some of that noise that we see in the chart in the mid-range in particular, at 12,800 ISO, is probably actually photon shot noise. It's not from the sensor. It's actually the noise that's actually in the light itself. So it's not something you can actually get rid of other than using noise reduction in post-production or in the camera or something else. It's actually there in the natural world. And it's something I think we need to be aware of as these cameras become more and more sensitive now, because it's something I'd forgotten, is that we're getting to the stage where that noise that's actually in the light becomes a problem. So if you go and try and shoot by moonlight, you're shooting at a very, very low light level, and yes, there's noise from the sensor and noise from the camera and its processing and things like that, but the light itself, because it's at such a low level, will contain sufficient noise that you'll actually be able to see the noise in the light. So there will become a point of it doesn't matter how sensitive we make these cameras, you're going to see noise. And a really good example of that actually is, I'm sure many of you will have seen stuff shot with image intensifiers. You know, that shooting wildlife at night, it's that green look. And they're always really noisy. And that's not because the device itself is noisy. So an image intensifier just takes what light there is and amplifies it through various processes. Most of that noise that you see when you look at an image intensified image is the photon shot noise. It's the noise in the light that's actually there. So we're getting into that realm of diminishing returns now, as we can make these cameras more sensitive perhaps, but the pictures won't get less noisy because you're actually going to start seeing the noise that exists in the light itself. It's a guy that's quite a fascinating person. It's one of those sort of geeky things that it's like, oh, that's cool. But then you're fighting against it, which is actually why I feel that the two ISOs in this camera are too far apart. I'd actually have preferred something a little bit lower. Maybe 8,000 ISO or something like that might actually be a bit more useful. But it looks really good at 12,800 ISO. Loading LUTs, does it have to be SD cards? No, it doesn't have to be SD cards. It can be a CF Express card as well, but it just has to be in slot B. If it's in slot A, the camera doesn't see the LUTs, doesn't see the thing. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. Just to clarify the difference between scene files and base look. So the scene file contains the everything. So it's your matrix settings. The base look is contained within the scene file. So you can take a scene file and add a base look to it. And then that would become a new effective. And then if you wanted to save that, you save that as a new scene file. So the base look is effectively your LUT. And then the scene file is the LUT plus any matrix changes or the black level changes or anything else that you've added on top of it. And you can save that scene file. And when you save the scene file, it saves your matrix changes plus the LUT that you used. The base look is basically where you load the LUT into the camera to use the LUT as your replacement of the gamma curve and the default matrix that's in the camera. If you're in the Cine EI mode, your base look is your LUT. If I go into Cine EI, so we're now in Cine EI, and if I go, oops, I want to do that, to my page here, you'll see that it calls the LUT base look. And you can see that I've got the very same LUTs. This is the same list. You see there's that LUT I put into memory number 6 down there. So the base look and LUTs are the same. So in the Cine EI mode, your LUTs are used as a LUT, as you would expect. But in custom mode, your LUTs are used as a base look. Basically, what's happening in custom mode is that the camera is using S-Log3 and adding a LUT and baking it in by default. So it's kind of like using the Cine EI mode. It's very much like using the Cine EI mode, shooting log and baking in the LUT. The only difference is that as well as baking in the LUT, we can still use the matrix and the other things to change the way the picture looks. So it's a bit more advanced than just baking in a LUT. But it's nice that we can do it, and I think it's a really neat feature in the camera. Have I tried using clear image zoom, and would I recommend it? Yes, I've tried it. It's probably actually activated. Is it? No, let's turn it on. So if I go into the menus, and I'm just trying to think which menu it's in, because it's tucked away. It's not actually obvious where it is. I think it's actually might be in the technical menu. Yeah, there it is. Technical menu, can turn on clear image zoom. And now when I press the zoom rocker, so just pressing the zoom rocker on the top of the camera, I can zoom in and out. So I'm not changing the focal length of the lens here, I'm zooming in and out. Now, a lot of people have asked, does that mean I could actually use this to shoot Super 35? Because by the time you've zoomed into here, then basically you have 1.5 times crop on the sensor, which is pretty much Super 35. Now let me see, I've got a different chart here. Just bear with me one moment because I'm going to change the chart here. And I'm going to use this one here. I should have brought a resolution chart with me because that would be much easier to see this. So this is a back focus chart. My wife hates this chart, says it sends her eyes funny. And I'm going to zoom in as close as I can optically, right? If I zoom out like this, now I'm not quite sure how this is going to come across on the live stream. Looking at this myself, I can see that swirly-whirly pattern going almost all the very way into the center. It's full resolution. If I zoom in with clear image zoom, it becomes less distinct. It becomes fuzzy and blurry. And in fact, the other thing that happens, especially if you've got gain in with the camera, is the pictures get quite noisy. Now I'm at 800 EI, so 200 EI, so that's going to be really nice and clean. But what I have found, and it's not obvious, clear image zoom is a really good tool. It works really well, so don't get me wrong here. This isn't something that looks horrible and looks nasty. But you are definitely losing resolution. Now just bear with me a second because we do have a resolution chart. Let's see if we can see it with this chart. So I'm just swapping charts over here. This is all very professional. And I will be back with you. We haven't finished yet. Okay. Now, can you see the trumpets on here? And again, it's going to be a little bit difficult to see, I suspect, in the stream. But as I zoom in, even though we're making the image larger, in fact, actually it's not doing what I want it to, it's too big, because this is a chart for HD and we're in UHD. No, it's not going to do what I wanted it to. I can guarantee you, I can assure you that by the time you've zoomed in, there is a resolution loss. And you tend to actually see it quite nicely on faces and skin tones. Let's try another little experiment here. Let me zoom out. I'm going to do, so I believe, I'm just trying to think out, I'm just thinking this through. What I want to do is give you two matching size images. So if I go to here, 24 mil, I know that when I zoom in like that, it's there, zoom out, that's the same as that, roughly. So this is 35 millimeter optical zoom, no clear image zoom. And if I come into the shot, flipping the LCD around so I can see, you might have to pause this and go back and have a look at it for yourself. And maybe if you can just see the chart over my shoulder, and you might have to pause this and replay this later to actually see the differences and compare the two. So this is just optical zoom. And then I'm going to get what I hope is a pretty close match just with clear image zoom. And you might be able to see some differences. I've tested this at home and I've done some side-by-side examples and compared them, and there is absolutely a loss in resolution and sharpness and detail and everything else. In fact, actually the sharpness doesn't change that much because Sony do a really good job of, as you zoom in with the clear image zoom, of sharpening the picture. But when you start looking at those resolution trumpets, you start to see that resolution really drop off. And it does make a difference. It really does. So this is clear image zoom now, and they're pretty blurry. Where are we focused? Yeah, so actually that's one of the other things is actually when you use clear image zoom, you lose the face autofocus. As I zoom back out and zoom in optically, I think you can actually, should be able to see they're a bit sharper now. So clear image zoom isn't horrible. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's horrible. But is it a replacement for a 35mm scan mode? No, it's not, because the resolution definitely is lower. The image isn't as nice. It's not as well rounded. Skin tones can get a bit coarse and a bit noisy sometimes. So it's not what I would consider a replacement. If you're trying to use Super 35 because you want to use some really beautiful PL mount glass and stuff like that, and you're having to use clear image zoom to do it, it seems a bit of a pointless exercise to me because you're not going to get the best that those lenses can deliver. Okay. Recommended optimum ISOs for S-Cinetone, the FX9 are 320 and 1600. No, that's for S-Cinetone. So the FX6 is also 320. So if we go, oops, on that one, that menu, if I go back to custom mode, and we are at, we're in dB. So let me just, and we're in 709 as well. Let's go back to S-Cinetone. Okay, so we're back in S-Cinetone. And if I, let's have a sensible shutter speed as well, because it stayed at 220 because of what we were doing previously with the, all right, so let's just get this exposed reasonably well. Okay, now if I go into the main menu and actually I need to go to shooting and we put this to ISO and you'll see that low is 320. So we're at 320. It's the same as the FX9. So 320 ISO for S-Cinetone, 800 for S-Log3 and Cine EI mode. Obviously, in the high base, it's different. If I change the base ISO to high, then our lowest is 5000 ISO. It's obviously a very different sensitivity up in the higher mode. Okay. Right. So so does the FX6 have a path for improvement changes via firmware, the same as the FX9? I don't see any reason why you couldn't update it with firmware. How much will happen? Would it change much? I don't know. I don't know what more you'd add, actually. It's already a really good camera and fully featured, and everything works. It's not like the RAW doesn't work and it needs to be added with a firmware update. So I'm not convinced that we'll see that many updates for this camera. You might see some things. I know that the A7S III has that tracking focus where you can touch on something and then it follows it. Now, whether that is technically feasible in this camera or not, I don't know. I don't really see why not. So maybe something like that, perhaps. But I kind of think this is a finished camera. And I don't really know what more you could add to it because it seems to be really leveraging that sensor that it's got and everything else very well already. So I don't know is the answer. I don't work for Sony. I'm not a Sony employee. Only the engineers at Sony would know what's coming or not coming for this camera. But it's a firmware-driven camera, so it's feasible. But whether that doesn't mean to say there's going to be those upgrades. Anyway, Yes, so I've covered, yes, you can output interlaced over the SDI and HDMI by shooting 50 or 60p and then turning the interlaced output on. We've really sort of come to the end of the allotted time today. So I do hope that you found this really useful. Let the guys at Visual Impact know if you found this useful, and we'll try and do lots more. I really like this format personally. I think it's one thing standing up and presenting a video and saying, this is how this mode works, blah, 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 blah. I do like the feedback. I do like getting the questions from you guys. And the same when I'm on Facebook or various user groups and things like that. I'm more than happy to try and help people if they've got a problem in those public spaces, because it benefits everybody. So keep the questions coming. You'll find me in various FS7, FX6 groups on Facebook if you've got more questions, or ping them to Visual Impact and they'll pass them on to me. And if there's enough interest, we'll do more. I want to do more. And if you come across somebody from Sony and you think I should do more for Sony as well, ask Sony, say, hey guys, can you get Alister to do some of the instructional videos like he did for the FX9, etc. And hopefully it will happen. So thank you very much for watching. Have a great day. Have a great Christmas, folks. Holiday season coming up. I know for a lot of us it's not going to be the same as usual, but I've put loads and loads of Christmas lights up outside the house this year, which I haven't done for many years, not since my daughter left home, and it's kind of raised my spirits a little bit. And there's lots of people doing similar things, and just be nice to people for the next month. Let's just be nice. Let's have a really great Christmas, everyone, and I look forward to doing some more with you guys in the new year. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.